Asylum, Chapter 6. Come on, wake up, damn it, get up! A voice cried out from a great distance, the words reverberating within her mind like the percussive beating of an oversized drum. A pinprick of light burst into existence on the horizon. The light began to grow larger, bearing down on her like a train within a darkened tunnel. Twilight couldn't look anywhere else, her head held immobile by some impossible force. She wanted to scream as a rushing sound filled her ears. The light grew exponentially as it bore down upon her. Twilight gasped and shot up right before the impact, her sudden movement causing the orderly that had been hovering over her to jerk back to avoid an accidental headbutting. "Gah!" he yelped as she glanced fearfully around the room. White tiles, harsh lighting, and the smell of disinfectant asserted Twilight's senses as she realized she was still in the bathroom. Her head throbbed in pain, her skull feeling like it was trapped in a vise and slowly being squeezed tighter. It was a headache as delivered by a hammer blow. 2 hammer blows, she corrected, feeling the sharper stings that marked the contact points where her head had fought something solid and lost. Twilight tried to sit up further but was arrested by a firm hoof planted against her chest. "Damn it, stay still!" the orderly barked, his voice dragging her eyes back to him and the irritable scowl on his face. "Geez, this isn't good at all." She felt a momentary thrill of fear at his words. No pony wanted to hear a hospital employee talking like that, especially when they flat on their back with their head ringing like a bell that had been struck too hard. "What happened?" he finally asked as he leaned in closer to examine her forehead. Twilight began, blinking her eyes as she tried to remember herself. "I pretended I need to go to the restroom so I could try and get a hold of my emotions. Once inside I got into a good-fueled rant with my reflection, then it mutated before my eyes and slammed my face into the mirror, causing me to fall over and hit my head on the tires, which knocked me unconscious. Again. And I'm absolutely not crazy. I slipped." The orderly's eyelids lowered. "You slipped." Twilight nodded and immediately regretted it when the clamps on her head tightened a few degrees more. Her headache was going to be one for the history books. Yeah, she said as she struggled to keep a grimace of pain off her face. "And all of that shouting right before you slipped?" I thought I saw a spider on my hoof, and I guess I kinda freaked out." She lied, giving him her best attempt at a nervous grin. It was surprisingly difficult considering how nervous she actually was. She couldn't let him know what had really happened. She couldn't let anyone know. "I'm sure." Disbelief and annoyance fought for dominance on his face. "Can you stand up?" Twilight nodded again, careful to bob her head slowly. Thankfully the headache didn't get any worse. The secret seemed to be not moving too quickly. Simple. "I think so. I need some help though." Sliding his forelegs beneath her, the orderly slowly lifted her onto her front. "Something like this had to happen today," he muttered to himself as he helped Twilight onto her hoofs, his expression a deep scowl. "Ratchet is going to have my flank for this." Also her legs felt weak. Twilight didn't fear a sudden collapse. Her body seemed to be growing more accustomed to coming out of unconsciousness. "How many did this make? 2? 3? She caught a glimpse of the mirror in the corner of her eyes. A memory of a ghoulish smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and Twilight shivered. "At least this time it wasn't my fault." "Are you alright? You look pale. You're not gonna slip again, are you?" "No, I think I'm good," she said. "Stay there. I need to clean that blood off your face," he told her, staring at her until she finally looked back to let him know that she understood. She wasn't in much of a hurry to move. Standing still for a minute or two was just what she wanted. She watched the orderly as he turned to the sink, and it slowly dawned on her just how lucky she was. The pain in her head tried to offer a counter-argument, but she persisted. She had avoided hitting her head on the sink when she went down. The tiled floor wasn't a pillow, but at least she managed to brace herself before the impact. If she had hit the sink, she would have been lucky to only lose a few teeth. A small cut and a bad headache were a blessing in comparison. Producing a glass from one of his pockets, it seemed every employee had one of those, he held it in his mouth as he pushed down on one of the sink's pedals. bathing it in cold water. Once he was finished, he turned off the water and glanced up. The claws fell from his slack jaw. What happened to the mirror? She felt a flicker of disbelief at how long it had taken him to notice the damage. It wasn't subtle after all. A spiderweb of fractured glass radiated from the impact point, breaking up the reflection into a fragmented tableau showing dozens of miniature stallions between the cracks, each one as stunned as the last. Her ears flattened against her head as he turned back to glare at her. "I slipped," she said defensively. "You slipped into the mirror. What, did you hurt yourself at the wall when you fell?" He groaned, rubbing his face with a hoof. "Oh jeez, she's going to kill me. Seriously, why today? Why did you have to do this to me today?" He glared at Twilight as if accusing her of doing it on purpose before he fetched the claws from the sink. Leaning forward, he began to roughly clean the small traces of blood from her forehead. He continued to grumble indistinctly, his voice muted by the fabric in his mouth. "What do you mean?" she finally asked him after he was finished. None of this was your fault." "Oh yeah, right," he said sarcastically as he dropped the claws into the sink and began scrubbing it firmly. "Ratchet is already on my flank for..." He paused for a moment. Without looking up, he returned to his task. "What am I saying? I don't need to tell you this. Besides, you're right. I'm not at fault here. You say you slipped and that's good enough for me. I'm gonna take you back to the doctors and you can explain to them how you managed to break the mirror. I didn't do a damn thing wrong this time." After finishing his cleaning, the orderly escorted Twilight from the bathroom. She spared a last glance into the broken glass, catching the sight of hundreds of miniature Twilights looking back at her with the same mask of neutrality she wore. The orderly flipped off the lights as he marched her out, and they all vanished into the darkness. "Just had to happen today." The orderly grumbled as he led her down the hallway, his earlier apathy towards her abandoned in favor of smoldering animosity. Like before, he didn't offer any conversation, also his silence had been replaced with frequent asides to himself about how much trouble he was in, the unfairness of the universe, and how badly he was going to get it when Nurse Ratched found out. Nurse Ratched was a recurring topic in his personal woes. Despite speaking to no pony in particular, he did nothing to keep Twilight from hearing his long list of grievances against the head nurse. That heartless witch, punishing hardworking ponies just because of an accident. She's going to tear me a new one, I just know it. Why today? She's going to have me on punishment detail for months, if I even keep my job. She doesn't even know the meaning of the word compassion. He puffed out his chest as he reached for the cafeteria door. "I swear, if she tries to pull that crap with me again, I'm going to tell her off for once. She deserves to be put in her place, the stupid The doors to the cafeteria pulled away from his hoof to reveal Nurse Ratched. He let out a strangled yelp as he jerked back, coughing as he desperately swallowed his unfinished insult. Twilight felt like she was watching a scene from a play, the timing so perfect as to make mere coincidence seem ludicrously improbable. There was a touch of the supernatural about his sudden appearance, as if the stallion had drawn the wrath of the gods of irony and comedic timing. The stallion scrambled backwards, giving ground as Nurse Ratched strode out into the hallway, her assistant Sayas a respectful step behind her. Nurse Ratched! The orderly finally choked out, trying to hide his unease beneath a terrible fake smile. It made him look as guilty as a cat covered in feathers. "How are you doing this afternoon?" She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes regarding him like she would a patch of mud on her coat. "Place," she said flatly, making no effort to return his greeting. Her gaze passed over the cringing stallion and found Twilight, her expression brightening into the familiar smile all the doctors and nurses seemed to wear. "Twilight! Why, it's good to see you up and about. I was quite worried about you, after your little fit in Dr. Rose's office. Are you feeling better, sugar?" "Yes, ma'am, I'm feeling much better," she said with a weak smile, as a reminder of the morning's events killing what amusement she had taken from Blaze's situation. Blaze began, but froze when Ratched spun her head to face him, the forced congeniality vanishing instantly. Her expression was cold granite, the lines of her frown chiseled into her face. He trembled despite being a head taller than the white and pink unicorn. She just what? She said, her professional tone not matching the contempt in her eyes. His mouth flapped open a few times. She just had a little accident in the bathroom. Ratchet's eyes narrowed. What sort of accident? She said she saw a spider and, slipped in the bathroom, so she, hit her head. He gestured at the small cut on Twilight's forehead. On the mirror and broke it, and it knocked her out. And this little accident happened when she was in your care? Blaze gulped. Yes, ma'am. I see. Those two words were delivered so coolly that they could have meant anything at all. Go tell the janitors that they have a mess to clean up. The orderly gushed with acknowledgments as he backed away from her. He turned around with relief and hurried off, maintaining just enough self-control to keep from sprinting. Ratchet sniffed disdainfully as she watched him retreat to safety. She turned back to Twilight, and her expression softened. Beneath it, though, Twilight could still sense some of that steely demeanor that had frightened a stallion almost twice her size. It was the same firm resolve she had seen that morning when she had touched the silence on her horn. Is what he said true, darling? Yes, Twilight answered, despite the gentle look on the nurse's face. She couldn't keep from stammering slightly as she met her golden eyes. Well then, stand still while I take a little look, alright, sugar? I just want to make sure it's nothing serious, she said. She lifted up Twilight's bangs, exposing the small cut on her forehead. Well, this doesn't look too bad, sweetie. Just stay still a little longer while I take care of this. Twilight obeyed, her eyes crossing as she tried to watch the nurse apply some disinfectant, the liquid bringing with it a momentary sting as it sterilized the cut. The small bottle hovered with a pinkish aura. She glanced enviously at Ratchet's horn as she returned the bottle to her pocket. Ah, this should do it, she said happily as she levitated a colored band-aid out of another pocket. Twilight ignored it, her eyes falling on the nurse's pockets as she wondered just how much the unicorn stored in there. There was a moment's pressure on Twilight's forehead. Much better, she said, giving Twilight a smile before turning to Sayers. It looks cute, don't you think? Cute? Twilight looked over at Sayers as well. The dark scion regarded her with the usual inscrutable expression, but she swore she saw the slightest hint of amusement in his eyes as he glanced at her forehead. Yes, he replied. Cute. I need to find a mirror. Twilight winced as soon as she registered the thought. A skeletal smile taunted her from the recess of her mind, bringing with it a swarm of vicious questions. What had I seen in the mirror? Had it been real? Had it been an illusion? What caused me to argue with myself? Dwarfing them all was the one question that Twilight dreaded above all others. Am I really starting to lose it? Just giving voice to the thought was enough to make her sweat. She could remember her grotesque reflection tormenting her with her own fears, laughing through its oversized smile as it told her what she had been fighting so hard to deny. No, I'm not crazy. It was a simple declaration of fact, an absolute certainty in an uncertain world. But, something whispered back. What if you're wrong? Twilight buried it all even deeper, doing her best to keep the terrible memories and painful questions suppressed. She couldn't deal with them now. Sure, it was just putting off the inevitable, but she didn't have any alternatives. It wasn't a logical or rational decision, but it was the only one Twilight could make. She just needed time to settle herself. She was hurt, had a pounding headache, and was still painfully hungry. They were pitiful excuses, but they were enough. What did Ratchet put on my cut? Is my bandage embarrassing? Wondered Twilight, the shift in focus a painfully obvious attempt to distract herself from the darker thoughts that were clawing at her mind. She ignored them. The strain of maintaining her denial only made the throbbing in her head worse, but she welcomed it. The stilted thoughts and dull aches were all preferable to considering other matters. Nurse Ratchet thankfully resumed speaking, creating another welcome distraction from memories best forgotten. Now, Twilight, head injuries are never to be taken lightly. What I want you to do is go back inside and finish your dinner. You're probably going to have a headache for a while, which is to be expected. But if you get any worse or start to get nauseous or dizzy or start feeling strange, please tell one of us right away, alright? Okay. Now, do you happen to remember what happened just before you slipped? Blaze said something about a spider, but I'd like to hear what you have to say. Twilight nodded. Yeah, I thought I saw a spider on my leg, and I got scared and must have stepped in some of the water. The nurse watched her as she repeated the lie. Small dots of sweat formed on her forehead as she tried to keep calm. It was difficult. It felt like the nurse was seeing right through her deception. It couldn't be helped. It was better that she suspected Twilight of hiding something than to know the truth. The truth? How could I tell her the truth? Part of Twilight wanted to return to what she had seen, but she desperately kept pushing it away. Every minute she gained without considering what had happened was a blessing. Twilight lowered her head, trying to mask her doubts with an apologetic tone. I'm sorry about the mirror. Nurse Ratched smiled. Oh, don't worry about it, Twilight. You're a good girl, and it was just an accident. Now, what I do is have someone come by your room later today before you go to bed, just to check in on you and make sure everything is fine. I think you'll be okay, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Twilight nodded again, even as she tried to figure out if the nurse believed her story or not. Nothing in Ratched's expression offered an answer either way, and say yes, it was easier to guess the thoughts of a mountain. Now, you were eating with Dr. Applejack, right? Asked Ratched as she ushered Twilight back into the cafeteria, her smile shrinking her hair. Yes, ma'am, that's right. Well, I think I saw where she was sitting. Just follow me, darling, and I'll walk you to your seat. Twilight thanked her as Ratched opened the door, but she paused at the threshold. She had only been gone a few minutes at the most, but the cafeteria was already packed. There had to be upwards of 200 ponies inside. The nurses and orderlies were out in force, herding the patients from the kitchen to the tables and trying their best to keep the patients seated during their meal. Despite the mass of bodies, there was a strange organization to be found, a suggestion of a plan in their movements. Groups filtered into the cafeteria one at a time like clockwork, a conductor's schedule to get the most ponies fed at the least amount of time. Her analytical mind could see how the nurses and orderlies guided their charges along according to some well-practiced timetable. Like ants hard at work, what might seem haphazard on the surface was actually organized chaos. But organized chaos was still chaos, a point made abundantly clear by the wall of sound that met her. Twilight considered the mob of ponies that filled the room. Being able to tell what they're trying to do isn't going to make getting to my seat any easier. Sayers gave her a gentle nudge from behind, and Twilight hurried after Nurse Ratched. Despite the morass of constantly shifting individuals, Twilight found herself able to move without running the risk of colliding with another pony. Ratched was cutting through the crowd like an icebreaker, and she followed gratefully in her wake. Her guide eventually stopped at a familiar table. Pinkie Pie was still huddled up against Applejack, but she was eating again, and seemed to be in no danger of crying. It was something, at least. Hello, Dr. Applejack, Nurse Ratched said, her tone painfully stiff. Nurse Ratched. Applejack nodded her greeting, matching the nurse's tone almost perfectly. Her eyes, however, flared with irritation. Applejack was doing her best to conceal it, but Twilight knew her friend too well to miss the annoyance she felt at the nurse's presence. Plus, she was a terrible liar. Twilight glanced between the two co-workers, curious as to what might have created the animosity between the two ponies. Unfortunately, the time was far from ideal, and if Twilight were honest with herself, she didn't feel ready to start trying to get such personal information so soon. She lowered her gaze to Pinkie Pie, a spike of good jabbing into her heart. No, she would wait before she tried prying into the lives of her friends. Instead, she added it to the list of minor questions for the future. Ratched shifted her gaze to the fifth pony, giving Pinkie Pie the same smile she had used on Twilight just seconds before. And hello to you too, Pinkie Mina. Staying out of trouble, I hope. Although she managed a weak grin in return, Twilight could see the slight apprehension in Pinkie's eyes when she looked up at the head nurse. Of course, Nurse Ratched. Pinkie Pie forced her smile a little wider. Excellent, said Ratchet happily. Her expression turned to stone once she turned back to the doctor. Dr. Applejack, there was an incident in the bathroom and Twilight here, she gestured to her side, slipped and hit her head. I've already banged her up and I assigned someone to look in on her later. Applejack nodded, about to speak when Nurse Ratchet cut her off. She ended up breaking a mirror in her fall, she added, an almost impeccable emphasis landing on the word mirror. The doctor's eyes flickered to Twilight for a moment. Is that so? She said evenly. It wasn't a question. Well, thanks for keeping me informed. I'll make sure to keep an eye on her, in case she hit her head harder than you think. Head injuries are never something to be taken lightly. My thoughts exactly. She gave Twilight another fake smile. Now you be a good girl for Applejack. If you need something else, don't be afraid to let us know. We want to make sure you stay nice and healthy, alright darling? She said before turning away, not waiting for a response. Twilight's eyes followed Ratchet and Sayers as they left. Ponies parted before them despite the crowded conditions, giving the pair room to move unimpeded. None of the patients looked either of them in the face. Within a few heartbeats they had disappeared from sight. Twilight turned back to the table to find Applejack staring at her. Hey, Applejack. Hey, Pinkie Pie, she said meekly, averting her eyes. Pinkie Pie continued to stare down at her soup and said nothing. So, you slipped and hit your head, Applejack stated, her jaw walking as if she were physically chewing on the idea. She glanced up at the bandage just beneath Twilight's horn. Twilight swore she saw a momentary flash of amusement in her eyes. Yeah? There was another pause. Well then, go ahead and sit down, Twilight. You'll want to rest a little to make sure nothing serious happened. Twilight did as commanded, sliding into a spot on the bench. Her bowl of beet soup, now cold, sat where she had left it. Yeah, Nurse Ratchet told me to talk to you if my headache gets worse, or if anything out of the ordinary happens. And has it? My headache hasn't gotten worse, she said, idly twirling her spoon around the entirely unappealing remains of her dinner. As for anything strange happening? Well, this whole day has been strange and out of the ordinary, so I think I just ignore that. Applejack continued to look at Twilight. Instead of the reproach and anger she had expected, her friend wore a stern look compounded by faint worry. She said nothing as she continued to mull over her thoughts, the silence becoming a large wall between them. Eventually, she rose from the table. Twilight, stay here. I'm going to get you some fresh soup, she said, pressing her lips together into a thin smile. Thanks, she replied. Applejack grin rose a fraction of an inch as she picked up Twilight's tray and walked off toward the kitchen. Twilight watched her go, focusing on the orange mare so she could prepare herself. She didn't know if she was ready to look at her other friend. Does your head hurt? Pinkie Pie asked quietly, forcing the issue without looking up from her own bowl. Like Applejack, Pinkie's face was free of resentment or blame. She just looked sad. Twilight felt that spike of good twist a little more at the sight of her friend looking so miserable. Yeah, a little, Twilight replied. I'm sorry to hear that. Twilight took a deep breath, letting it out through her nose. No, Pinkie, I'm the one that is sorry, she said, reaching out to take one of Pinkie Pie's hoofs in her own. She didn't pull away from her touch, but the limp was limp in her grasp. I brought up something I shouldn't have. I was being so selfish and impatient that I should have known better. I'm sorry, Pinkie. I really am. It's okay, Twilight, Pinkie said, a faint smile playing on her face as she continued to stare down at the table. She squeezed the unicorn's hoof softly. I sometimes let things bother me that shouldn't. There are things I don't like to think about, like in my past, and sometimes I hear things and I don't know. I can't help but think about what happened. You didn't do anything wrong, Twilight. I try and do my best, but I still have lots and lots of work to do. Oh, Pinkie, Twilight whispered. The sincerity in Pinkie Pie's voice was enough to melt the last of her shame away, but in its place grew pity and sadness. A pony so filled with laughter and happiness should never be so distraught. I've been so confused lately. So many things just don't make sense. My whole life has been turned upside down, and it's hard to hold on to what I know is real. But I'm always there for you, Pinky. I told you, I wouldn't be a rude jerk to my friends ever again. It was a pinky promise, and I broke it. So I just have to work twice as hard to make it up to you, okay? Pinky sniffled, lifting her head slightly. Well, I guess, she said as her slight grin swelled with life. Also, breaking a pinky promise is a really terrible thing to do. I mean, I don't know if I can just forgive you so easily. That's like super important. You're gonna have to make sure that you do something really extra special spectacular to make up for it. I'll try and get you cupcakes. Deal! Pinkie Pie shouted as she lunged over the table and caught Twilight in a furious hug before she could escape. Twilight returned the embrace, a burst of movement drawing attention from a number of patients and staff. She blushed, doing her best to ignore the bemused stares. Evidently they were used to Pinkie's exuberance as well. Pinkie, I think it's enough hugging, she said, gently trying to free herself from the Earth Pony's firm grip. There's no such thing! Come on, Pinkie, they're starting to stare at us. She nuzzled Twilight's chest a little more firmly. I don't care. Pinkie, please, I love you too, but this is embarrassing. Oh, fine, she allowed, releasing her grip around Twilight's neck and returning to her seat across from the unicorn. Her bright blue eyes glittered with relief and happiness. If it makes you feel better, her face took on a fox-serious expression. But you still owe me. Next time we have playtime, I get all the hugs I want, and cupcakes! Understand? Twilight chuckled. Okay, Pinkie, it's a deal, she said, straightening her mane with a hoof as she did her best to ignore the last few lingering stares. Her hoof passed over the bandage just beneath the horn. Just, let's try avoid making such a scene in the future. It's embarrassing. Pinkie Pie finally looked up, her eyes bulged out of their sockets, and she burst into a fit of raucous laughter. What? Twilight asked with bewilderment. She glanced behind herself, but there was nothing humorous that she could see. Pinkie, what's so funny? Pinkie bit her lip, her forelegs wrapped around her chest as she tried to hold in her laughter. I bet it wasn't the hug they were looking at. She snorted. Her eyes lifted up to Twilight's forehead and she erupted with more loud guffaws, dangerously close to falling out of her seat. What? Seriously, what's so funny? Twilight demanded, her cheeks warming up again as other ponies began staring at the two of them again. The irritation of being left out of the joke began to seep into her tone. Do I have something on my face? Yes, and it's so cute! Pinkie Pie shouted, pounding her hoofs against the table. She looked to be on the verge of tears. Wait, do you mean my bandage? Asked Twilight, crossing her eyes as she instinctively glanced upwards. What's so funny about it? Nothing. Pinkie giggled, stuffing her hoof in her mouth to stifle her laughter as she pointedly avoided looking at Twilight's forehead. Nothing at all. Twilight's stern look was ruined by her flushed cheek and the hoof she placed protectively over the bandage. Pinkie? Oh, it's not that funny. She finally admitted as she wiped a tear away. She coughed to mask another laugh. Still, what is it? Oh, I don't want to ruin the surprise. There was a mischievous glint in her eyes. Twilight sighed. This is part of my punishment for breaking a pinky promise, isn't it? Maybe. I thought so. She grumbled, turning attention to the rest of the cafeteria inhabitants. She rubbed the sore spot on her forehead. I need a mirror. An image of a reflection leering back at her with a dead smile flashed through her mind, threatening to drown her in the ocean of doubts and questions she was doing her best to ignore. Twilight clamped down on the thought before it could escape, bottling everything up and sealing it away. She wasn't going to think about it. She wasn't ready to deal with what had happened. You're afraid. The whisper was so faint as to be almost inaudible beneath the loud cacophony of the filled cafeteria. She had misheard a snippet of conversation, obviously. It was nothing but a figment of her imagination. Twilight shivered. Fighting to suppress her thoughts about what had occurred in the bathroom, Twilight stared purposefully out into the crowd as she focused her mind onto the many dozens of other ponies in the room. A few ponies from before remained. Carrot Top, Berry Punch, the Mummy. Even Applejack could be glimpsed through the mass of bodies, standing by the kitchen queue, chatting with another pony in a white lab coat. Most of the ponies were complete strangers though. Twilight turned her head around, hoping and dreading the sight of more familiar faces in equal measure. It was hard to pick out individuals. The presence of so many ponies moving about made identification a true challenge. The nurses and orderlies were doing their best to keep patients seated once they got their food, but dinner was still just beginning. The long lines of patients being herded to the tables meant ponies flickered in and out of sight, a snapshot of a mane or a face that disappeared in a heartbeat. Rainbow Dash. Twilight blinked and she was gone.